All right, on to OPM 90. Yeah, that's a pretty significant number in this 10-year commemoration because it marks the first quarter, the end of the first quarter. And at the end of the first quarter, we've completed 90 videos, and that's pretty significant. So starting on February the 13th, today is, well, actually, really, in terms of the date, yesterday would have been the end of the first quarter, but we, February, March to April, April to May. So 3 months, end of the first quarter. But in terms of numerically, because there are 360 plus meditations, it's 90 is really the end of the first quarter. Okay, so continuing on here, and I have already written out the commentary on so that you'll see that on the blog post, and also if you watch this video on YouTube, you'll see it there described. This is an interesting meditation because it's the first time that Plotinus, who's an important figure for me in my work, he has been since I was an undergraduate at Fordham, and in some ways Plotinus is, well, I wouldn't say he's the most important figure, but he is one of the most. But he's the most important figure that appears the least amount, if that makes sense. In other words, of all the important sources, he doesn't get his own chapter, and he just kind of briefly appears and then and goes away. And in terms of, that's disproportionate. That is to say, his appearance in this writing is disproportionate to the influence he had on me. And there's really no rhyme or reason to this project other than I just sort of forged ahead. Of course, I was reading a lot of Heidegger, and he was a huge influence and a huge source, and probably the main interlocutor for me and conversation partner throughout. But it wasn't as if I, had a pile of things I was going through and sort of laid it out in terms of where I was going. It was very free form and very improvisational. So anyway, let's get going. As Heraclitus indicates, the sage's appeal is always an invitation to dwell, an enjoyment that gathers the dialogic, the reciprocal exchange. Logos appears as an offering, an evocative submission. The evocative can only appear when it evokes. Thus, the poetic dwelling of the sage is only fulfilled in the company of the other who is able to receive the offering. Quote, the more poetic the poet is, the freer, that is, the more open and ready for the unforeseen, the greater is the purity with which he submits what he says to an ever more painstaking listening. It's from Heidegger. Freedom is established in relation to openness and the readiness for the unforeseen, for its coming to be happens with the offering that is received and responded to. This response, this hearing, is a creative act, the work of making meaning from the submission, the offering. As an offering, the submission relies upon the reception, the painstaking listening. This suggests that the appearance of logos, as a conveyance of what remains hidden, concealed, requires the existent standing of the ones who are capable of hearing. The freedom of the sage, as the poetic speaker, is related to, and in a sense determined by, the freedom of the apprentice, the learner. Put differently, the sage's dwelling is only fulfilled upon the arrival of the strangers who are ready to cross over and learn. Heraclitus is free when and if he's able to submit his invocation and gather together a community of learners. In sum, poetic dwelling emerges in the reciprocal exchange, the give and take, the offering, and receiving, responding. The logos must be heard in order for it to appear. In our unpacking of the sage's poetic dwelling, we have discovered the ineffable as the gathering together of learning. The ineffable is the name offered to describe the possibility embedded in the not yet, that always appears in the saying that is evocative. The ineffable is not simply that which cannot be described in words, but that which exceeds the forms of expression we find immediately available to us. The ineffable disrupts and thereby estranges us from our capacity to speak, to propose a name for that which makes its appearance. The ineffable directs the existent standing of freedom as the letting be of that which appears. We now understand better letting be as initiated by the steadfast openness of hearing. The ineffable appropriates the hearing that gives rise to mindfulness. The ineffable denotes the sublime, or that which initiates awe, wonder, that which is evocative. A saying is poetic when it is evocative and thereby points beyond itself. And pointing beyond itself, it thereby conveys an excess to be taken up through the work of meaning-making. The ineffable places emphasis both on what already is and not yet, beyond but present, and the modality of hearing that is now identified as the originary and initiative manner of being ready for the unforeseen. Plotinus, who recovers the wisdom of Heraclitus that is silent in the work of Plato, calls our attention to the ineffable when he speaks of the one that is, quote, absent from nothing and everything, present only to those who are prepared for it and are able to receive it, unquote. Plotinus emphasizes the experiential or phenomenological manner of the encounter with being's processual unfolding, an experience that always exceeds language, specifically propositional logic, and can thereby only be conveyed poetically. To speak precisely about the ineffable requires one to speak tentatively and evasively, that is, evocatively. Such speaking is, however, always following upon a hearing, and thus it is at best a memory or a recollection. And the hearing that receives the ineffable is prior to and distinct from knowing, and is, as we have emphasized, disruptive of the expectations and impulse of cognition. The more poetic a poet is, the freer, that is, the more open and ready for the unforeseen. The further what he says is from the mere propositional statement that is dealt with solely in regard to its correctness and incorrectness, unquote from Heidegger. Plotinus underlines the ineffable as the gathering directive of learning when he identifies the challenge of teaching, the saying of the sage, to be the bearing of this directive. The sage must speak evocatively and bear the message of the gods, and thereby defer from his own saying. This deferral has the important effect of drawing the listener into listening, into the open region of learning, and thereby to the existent stand of one who attends to the other. Yet the deferral also invites a response from the one who listens by submitting the poetic saying to the listener. The deferral calls attention to the response, to the reception as a taking up and making meaning with the saying. The sage thus stands as a constant intermediary, the one who calls attention to, who points and thereby directs by conveying a directive gathering. This arises when the listener heeds the appeal of language from the sage that points toward that which is not yet, which is present but unforeseen, appearing and hiding. Here too the gods are present. For wisdom, listen not to me but to the word, and know that all is one. Those are from Heraclitus. The word conveys, directs, and transports because it does not capture nor definitively define, but defers. Teaching is always a deference to the creative, initiative act of learning, an act carried forward by painstaking listening. Thus, to teach is nothing else than this, to let learning happen. We can now say to speak evocatively is nothing else than this, to let hearing happen. Teaching is the invocation of hearing beings beckoning to receive the gift of teachability, to dwell poetically. This is the challenge of the sage. Quote, the chief difficulty is this: awareness of the one comes to us neither by knowing nor by the pure thought that discovers other intelligible things, but by a presence transcending knowledge. We must renounce knowing and the knowable. That is why Plato says of the one, quote, it can neither be spoken nor written about. That's from Plotinus. If nevertheless we speak of it and write about it, we do so only to give direction, to urge towards that vision beyond discourse, to point out the road to one desirous of seeing. Instruction only goes so far as showing the road and the direction. That's from Plotinus. To hear wisdom is to remain silent. And that's where it ends this day, the 14th of May, 2014, originally written in 2004.